Welcome. Today we are going to talk about how to customize a potting mix for your orchid. Your orchid's environment, including the potting mix, will really impact the health of your orchid. If you are able to grow an orchid with healthy roots, then you're more likely to have an orchid with healthy leaves and an orchid that will bloom and grow for you. So the potting mix, you can customize it and you can be able to create something that is really specific for your growing environment. It doesn't matter if you live in an arid desert like I do, or if you live in a really wet and humid climate. No matter where you live, you can really customize the potting mix to be able to grow an orchid that will bloom and grow and look really healthy, both from the roots to the leaves, all the way up to the flowers. So there are three main parts to orchid care, and that is the light that your orchid receives, the temperature, and especially the day and night temperature, and also water. And water is really important, and you can really customize the way your orchid takes up water based on the potting mix. So that's really what we're going to talk about today. Is when you talk about potting your orchid, you're really talking about watering your orchid, because the type of potting mix that you use will impact how much water the potting mix soaks up and how free draining it is. And it's really important to understand these so that you can grow an orchid that will grow well for you. So I just want to give you a couple of examples. About a month or two ago, I visited a woman, Annette, and she grows orchids in a greenhouse. So she has a potting mix that is really specific for her growing environment, that she's able to really specifically and carefully control. So the potting mix that she uses is kind of a coarse fir bark mixed with sponge rock. So sponge rock is kind of a larger perlite. So if you have like a potting mix that you use just like for regular plants, not orchids, you'll see those little tiny bits of white, and that's perlite. So what we want for orchids is larger perlite. So with this larger fir bark that she uses, along with the sponge rock, it's a very open potting mix. So the water is very, very free draining. So let's kind of look at another situation. So if you pick up a Phalaenopsis orchid from the grocery store, many times they are grown in sphagnum moss. And sphagnum moss is very absorbent, and it doesn't allow a lot of air movement, especially with the way that they're really packed in there. And that makes it so that these orchids are easily transportable and that they'll stay wet and they won't dry out. So it really fits that situation. Think about your orchids and what kind it is. So for example, if you grow slipper orchids, I have a Phragmipedium growing behind me. It's just absolutely gorgeous and I love it. And they are more terrestrial orchids, semi-terrestrial. They kind of grow in leaf litter. The roots don't really go very deep. And they also don't have pseudobulbs. They don't have extra water storage. And so they need something that will be more absorbent for the type of orchid that it is. It doesn't have pseudobulbs and it does have nice thick roots, but it needs something that drains, that is never soggy, but does retain some moisture. And you'll notice your Phalaenopsis orchids, they don't have their own water storage either. So they need something that is free draining, but also keeps some moisture in the potting mix. Let's look at a Cattleya or a Dendrobium, for instance. They do have pseudobulbs, and so they need something that's kind of draining, and they like to be able to dry out between watering generally. So those are just a couple of examples of ways that you want to manipulate the potting mix based on the orchid and also the environment. So we have Annette's greenhouse. We have the orchid distributors transporting their orchids. So they want to keep theirs nice and moist. But then let's look at our own home. So whether you grow outside or inside, that will also have an impact on the type of potting mix that you'll like to use. So for example, if you grow Vanda orchids outdoors and you live in a really nice tropical climate, then you would probably want to use just some large pieces of bark, and they're not even really potted up. A lot of times they're just kind of in a basket with very thick roots that need to be watered regularly. So another example, if I'm growing my orchids indoors in my house, then I probably have a humidity problem. So I'll need to increase the humidity, and I'll need something that balances my orchids' need for water without ever being soggy. So generally speaking, most orchids do not like their roots to sit in water. So let's talk about some different potting mix components. All right, the first thing we want to do is to talk about different components that will make up your potting mix so that you can really customize it for your orchid's needs. The main things that we'll talk about are decay resistance, the pH, the weight, the water absorbency, and the cost of these components. So the first one is bark. The most popular types of bark are Douglas fir and Monterey pine bark, and it comes in different sizes. There's fine, which is about 1/4 inch, and it's great for seedlings, fine-rooted, and terrestrial orchids. Another size is medium, and that's about 1/2 inch, and those are great for things like Phalaenopsis, Cattleya, Dendrobium, Oncidium, and this is kind of your basic, what you would want for most types of orchids, and that is the medium. A large is 1 inch plus, and that would be good for something like a Vanda orchid. Fir bark, Douglas pine, the Monterey pine is supposed to last a little bit longer than the Douglas fir, and has a bit of a higher pH than the Douglas fir. So this is kind of your foundation, is the pine bark for potting up orchids. And you can see it, there's a bit of horticulture charcoal, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. So just going back to the fine 1/4 inch, a terrestrial orchid, an example of that would be like a Paphiopedilum type orchid. So let's talk about components that open up the potting mix. So by opening up the potting mix, what I mean by that is it's more free draining and lets water flow through the potting mix most readily. Okay, so the first thing is horticulture charcoal, and it has a very high decay resistance. It's very lightweight, it's pH neutral, and it has a low water absorbency. So one thing that is really nice about horticulture charcoal is that it does absorb salts, fertilizer salts, away from the roots. Sponge rock has a high pH, so it's alkaline. It's very lightweight, and it has a very low water absorbency, and it is inexpensive. Another thing that's interesting about perlite is it can also absorb salts, so it can be leached. If it has too many salts that are absorbed into the sponge rock, then you can distill it or leach the salts away with distilled water. Okay, here is some coarse pumice. It has a very high alkalinity, so it has a higher pH. It's heavy, it does not absorb much water, and it's on the more expensive end potting components. So it can also absorb salt, so it can also be leached. Those salts can be leached away with distilled water. All right, another thing you can use are clay pellets. This can also be known as leca or allophor, and it also has a very high decay resistance. It has a neutral pH. It's somewhat heavy, and it's not very water absorbent, and it's also on the higher end of cost. And like some of the other things that we talked about, it also can absorb fertilizer salts. Okay, lava rock is another component that people like to use. It has a neutral pH. It's also very heavy, and it does not absorb much water, and it's kind of a medium cost, and it can also absorb fertilizer salts. Another interesting component is cork. Cork is lightly acidic, and it's lightweight, has a low water absorbency, has a moderate cost, and it's also resistant to molds and funguses. So that's a really good attribute of cork. All right, so now let's talk about components that retain or absorb water. So if you need something that will absorb water and keep your orchid roots wet longer, then these are things that you would want to think about. The first thing is sphagnum moss, and this is something that you see a lot. It's pretty common. It has a low pH, so it's slightly acidic, and it is lightweight unless it's wet, and then it becomes heavy with water. So it's very absorbent. The cost is low to medium. One thing that you want to look for is that it is a long fibered New Zealand moss. So the higher quality, definitely the better. You can get like some little thorns in it, so it can be good to wear gloves when using this. Another thing that is also really good about sphagnum moss is that it is lightly antiseptic when it is fresh. So it can be good if you're dealing with an orchid that needs an extra TLC or even a little seedling. Sphagnum moss can be good, or if you just want to mix it in. Okay, rock wool. This is pretty much like fiberglass. It's not very pretty. So I would say the biggest downside to rock wool is that it is not very nice to look at. It has a pH neutral. It is lightweight unless it's wet. It can be very absorbent, has a medium cost, and mostly it's just not very attractive. And then there's also coconut fiber chunks. Kind of the downside to coconut fiber is that it can break down and decay quite quickly. It also has a low pH, so that's on the acidic end. It's lightweight. Absorbency is moderate when fresh, and then the more quickly it decays and breaks down, then it becomes more absorbent, has a medium cost. So in his book, Orchid Modern, Mark Hatchadorian, he has some recipes that he talks about in his book. So he recommends 2 parts medium fir bark, 1 part fine fir bark, 1 part sponge rock, and 1 part horticulture charcoal, so terrestrial. So that would be terrestrial orchids are things like cymbidiums, paphiopedilums, phragmipediums. Those are more terrestrial orchids, also jewel orchids. So keep in mind that sponge rock is large perlite, if you're more familiar with that. Okay, so here's an example of a paphiopedilum that would use this type. Here's another path. Okay, I have several examples. They're just so cool looking. I love that pouch right there. So fun. Okay, so here's the phragmipedium like I have in my background behind me. They're just so pretty. And Miltoniopsis. Okay, so a small cattleya have smaller roots, small oncidiums. Orchid right here. Okay, so now let's talk about epiphytic orchid mixes. So this is 3 parts medium fir bark, 1 part sponge rock, and 1 part horticulture charcoal. So remember that these can all be customized. And make it so that it fits your growing environment. So many people like to add some sphagnum moss to this mix, or something that is a bit more absorbent. So some examples of epiphytic orchids are the very common and very beautiful Phalaenopsis. Just love the spots and stripes. Here's a dendrobium, another dendrobium. This one's called firewings, Dendrobium nobile. There is another dendrobium. And here's a larger oncidium and a larger cattleya. So they like the more epiphytic mixes, and even the cymbidium, even though it is more in the terrestrial, it also has larger roots. And the vanda, it likes the really large 1-inch roots. There's another vanda. So let's talk about a few tips for keeping your orchid healthy. The number 1 tip when you are repotting and customizing your mix, do it before the potting mix breaks down, because then your orchid, if your potting mix breaks down, then it will be too wet and the roots will stay too wet and the water won't drain, and this is what can happen. So this is a sour potting mix with rotten roots, and it looks Terrible, right? And this didn't have to happen. A fresh potting mix could have prevented that. Okay, you can see right here we have salts buildup, and that is caused by not leaching the salts, not rinsing the fertilizer salts. And right here, the roots still look pretty good, but you can see that the potting mix is starting to break down. So if it starts to look crumbly, then it's a good sign. Okay, look at that. Just stayed soggy. They don't like their roots to stay wet. It's just completely waterlogged. Here's another example of waterlogged roots. And this is what happens to the leaves when the roots die. Thank you for joining me in this video where we talked about different potting components that we can use to either open up an orchid potting mix and make it so that water flows through more freely, or how we can add a bit more water absorbency. So join me in the next video and I will actually go through the process in my orchid room, and I'll create a couple of different potting mixes, and then we'll talk about different components that we'll add to customize those mixes. If this video resonated with you and you liked it, then subscribe and share it and comment, and then join me in the next video where we'll actually make these potting mix recipes.